That's funny.
Little shouting.
Okay, purchase incident. So, look, well, mostly it's done, so I was going to do some more of the more recent work, except for actually this particular slide. And I'm sure there's a lot of names in the room here which we have not included in those slides, so I apologize for that. But we just tried to pick some and of course also point out some of Frank's work. Now, it is important when so here we're still looking at zero-order behavior, but now rather than trying to predict the individual choice, we're looking at purchase incidents and things like penetration for a product, or things like how many times does the consumer purchase a product within a certain time period. So it is important to point out Andrew Ehrenberg's work, and all of you who have taken Frank's seminars probably remember that his story is how Andrew Ehrenberg, when he was younger, was working as an applied statistician for a marketing research company and was just looking at the data. So just graph after graph, graph after graph, looking at the data, and came up with the idea of the MBD model. And as a little sidetrack, there was actually this, later on this debate between Frank and Andrew Ehrenberg on the Generalizability Conference in Wharton. And of course the issue what came out in marketing science in 1995, where Andrew Ehrenberg was more like, okay, data first, theory second, and then Frank more about theory first, data second, and so a little bit different in philosophy. Okay, moving on, looking at these purchase incident models, so I think some very important contributions here by Frank and this sort of work by Bass, Jolande and Wright, and Jolande, Bass and Wright, making an extension of the MBD model, I almost said Bass model, to the multivariate case, so doing the Dirichlet model. Now, there's one thing though about the Dirichlet model, is that it does not allow for asymmetric switching, and therefore does not allow for any structure in the market. So that kind of makes a nice move to the next slide. And looking at choice models and market structure. And again, I think Frank has definitely made some important contributions in this area. One of the earlier models, the Hendry model, and so the paper by Frank and co-authors, which have looked at coming up with a theoretical explanation of it within marketing and an application of it. Another interesting paper, I think, was the Grover and Srinivasan, where they just basically said, well, we're going to divide the market into different segments. So we're going to have the loyal consumers and the switchers. And then the extension by Jane, Bass, and Chen, incorporating heterogeneity within these different segments. I thought another interesting paper by Terry Elrod, Choice Map, where they kind of combined multidimensional scaling and the brand choice decision. And so I was talking about it with Terry, and he gave me a nice example about this. He said, well, if you're looking at consumers, and there's one consumer who always purchases Diet Coke, and even though we don't incorporate this in the model will be able to pick this up and get a nice market structure based upon the switching. One of my own extensions of using this vector analytic model in a hazard framework. So after these kind of models, I think there was an important other area which started looking more at choice models and aggregate behavior. And of course, McFadden's conditional logic model had an important role in this area. But also again, the work by Frank and some of his students, where they tried to take individual level data and combine it with aggregate level data. And finally here, a classic, the Kaldani and Little paper, which was the first application of a logit model to scanner data. Now again, these are more like aggregate level models, and so the focus here, they're still zero order models, but the focus was more so on market share rather than individual choice. Now really the next step became is, well, we want to incorporate some more individual component in the model. Now maybe the logit of the loyalty measure was a first step of that. But then really became the area of heterogeneity. Let's incorporate some individual specific components within the model. And again, we see a number of papers here by Frank, who has also made some and I do have to say, there's of course a lot more earlier work also by Frank and like his students in the area of heterogeneity. But I was looking here a little bit more at the logic model. Kamakura and Russell, who started out with a latent class approach, and it's basically the idea, well, we have this underlying heterogeneity, and we can estimate this with a number of discrete mass points. This really, like had a little bit of a question or a debate about, if you have this heterogeneity, potentially highly multivariate, can you estimate this by just a few discrete mass points? And more recently, we have seen more of a focus on Bayesian modeling. And of course, Eric also has been doing a lot of work in this area. But I just summarized this by a book, what is forthcoming by Craig and co-authors on Bayesian modeling. I want to make a few other points about this. So, the importance of heterogeneity. If we're looking at the models, the one thing what we know that if you incorporate heterogeneity, models fit significantly better. But the question, of course, is also, what is the importance of the heterogeneity on the parameter estimates? And in a lot of the models, like the linear models, it may be more so just on parameter efficiency. But for example, in the work what I've done with Frank, where we have a nonlinear hazard model, it can actually lead to badly biased results if you do not account for the heterogeneity. So after that, it came more of a theory of a point where they started incorporating more bells and whistles maybe into the choice model. And so one area was where they started to say, well, we're going to be looking at both the brand choice and the purchase timing decision. And again, and there's of course some other papers also by Frank, which could have been included here, which are on other slides, and of course work by Deepak. And so here the focus was on like a hazard model. What is the likelihood of someone making a purchase given that they have not purchased yet? And then extensions to competing risk models, where we kind of say not only the purchase, but we want to take a look at maybe saying, well, catch-up is very popular in academics, so we're going to be looking people switching from Heinz to Hans, but also from Hans to Heinz, and we can have asymmetries in the switching behavior. All right, so then some of the more recent work, and so I was looking at this actually. Well, as you all probably know here, Frank, together actually with John Little, were nominated at some point in time for the Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, they didn't get it. So Frank told me a couple of years ago, he said, well, Peter, if I'm ever still going to get it, it's going to be for my contributions to the Bass model. So we're not going to see many contributions here in the later work by Frank, because he really has been focused on the Bass model. So I wanted to take a look at some, maybe a couple of interesting areas, and saying from, well, earlier all of the work has been mostly focusing on zero-order behavior. Now what we're starting to see is more like some dynamic models, potentially taking into account some higher order behavior. Make a couple of points here, some work by Dominic and co-authors, where they have looked now also at the longer term effect of marketing mix variables. And of course Don also has a paper in this area with co-authors. It started also becoming more important in trying to tease out the effect of both heterogeneity and state dependence, and different kind of state dependence in models, and also potentially just instances of learning by consumers. Now, I finally want to finish it up with some research which is wrong. You'll see what I said. About structural modeling. And so I couldn't take it out anymore now.
Dr. Bass.
But So that there's some more recent focus on this particular area, and I think Marcel really, so we all know okay, logit model, reduced form model, and so what we're doing with these structural models based upon theory. So I say, okay, consumers are for logit model, utility maximizers, we incorporate budget constraints, and then we derive a structural equation of a structural model. And one thing what we can get out of that is the different kind of measures in that where we're looking at policy implications, which we cannot get out of the regular logit model. And so things like consumer welfare would be one measure, and so you can actually do some of these analysis and kind of say what is the impact of a, let's say a price promotion or a reduction in price or a change in quality on consumer welfare. There's definitely a question on whether these models really help or hinder prediction. I think there may be a little bit more about explanation, and although I think Frank had some very interesting views about these models. And here I will give the floor to Albert.